Power rarely collapses with a bang. Sometimes it fails quietly, inside offices where assumptions stop working. This was one of those moments. There was no press conference. No rupture at the border. Trade did not stop. Diplomatic language stayed polite. On paper everything looked normal. But inside Washington a core assumption failed. The assumption was simple, that Canada could be leaned on. That economic exposure to the United States would translate into compliance once pressure was applied. That assumption had been comfortable for decades. This time it was wrong. Stay with me because the real significance of this moment only becomes clear once you understand how quietly leverage stopped functioning. According to reporting by outlets like Reuters and the Associated Press, the White House signaled potential trade pressure against Canada during a period of heightened tariff threats and renegotiation rhetoric under Donald Trump. The expectation inside Washington was familiar. Signal displeasure. Hint at tariffs. Imply consequences. Wait for adjustment. That pattern had worked before. Canada did not respond publicly with counter-threats. There was no nationalist rhetoric. No emergency summit. Instead, Canadian officials made routine-sounding administrative moves. Procurement timelines were adjusted. Trade diversification efforts continued. Diplomatic engagement outside North America intensified quietly. Reuters noted at the time that Canadian policymakers emphasized predictability, rules-based processes, and long-term stability rather than reactive bargaining. From the outside it looked uneventful. From the inside the pressure simply did not land. The mechanics of why conventional pressure failed reveal something deeper about how leverage actually works between trading partners with asymmetric vulnerabilities. Washington's approach relied on a fundamental assumption, that Canada's economic integration with the United States created automatic compliance incentives. The threat of disruption would, in theory, force immediate recalibration. But this overlooked how Canada had been quietly restructuring its economic dependencies for years, diversifying supply chains, expanding trade relationships with European and Asian partners, and building institutional buffers that could absorb short-term turbulence without triggering political panic. The Canadian response demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of negotiation timing and public psychology. By refusing to engage in dramatic public posturing, Ottawa denied Washington the spectacle it needed to demonstrate strength. There were no angry statements to quote, no emergency meetings to photograph, no crisis narrative for media consumption. This absence of reaction was itself a form of strategic communication. It suggested that the threatened measures were either manageable or not credible enough to warrant visible concern. The optics shifted subtly but significantly. Instead of Canada appearing cornered, the situation began to resemble a one-sided conversation where the speaking party was talking to itself. Behind the bureaucratic language about procurement adjustments and diversification lay concrete preparations that had been underway long before the threats materialized. Canadian trade officials had mapped out alternative sourcing arrangements for critical goods, identified new export markets for sectors vulnerable to American tariffs, and coordinated with provincial governments on economic contingency planning. These weren't reactive scrambles, they were the activation of systems built for exactly this scenario. When pressure arrived, the infrastructure to manage it was already operational. The appearance of calm wasn't performance, it reflected actual readiness. The emphasis on rules-based processes served multiple strategic functions simultaneously. It positioned Canada as the mature, predictable actor in contrast to unilateral pressure tactics. It appealed to international audiences and multilateral institutions whose support might matter in future disputes. It created legal and procedural frameworks that complicated rapid American action, introducing delays and review processes that diluted urgency. And it maintained domestic political cohesion by framing the response as technical and institutional rather than ideological or partisan. The Canadian government avoided being drawn into the kind of nationalistic chest-thumping that can box leaders into rigid positions and limit flexibility. What Washington interpreted as passivity was actually strategic patience backed by structural preparation. The calculus in Ottawa wasn't about matching threats with counter-threats or escalating tension to force compromise. It was about outlasting pressure by demonstrating that the threatened consequences wouldn't produce the desired behavioral change. This approach required confidence that the economic fundamentals, export diversity, fiscal reserves, public support for steady leadership, could sustain the strategy through an extended period of uncertainty. The absence of visible panic signaled to markets, trading partners, and domestic constituencies that Canadian policymakers had assessed the situation and determined it was manageable. The international diplomatic engagement that intensified during this period wasn't coincidental or purely symbolic. Canada was actively building alternative relationships and reinforcing existing ones, creating options that reduced dependence on American goodwill. Trade missions to Asia accelerated. European partnerships deepened. Participation in multilateral forums became more prominent. These moves served both practical and signaling purposes. They generated real economic alternatives while demonstrating to Washington that unilateral pressure would simply push Canada toward other partners, potentially weakening American influence rather than strengthening it. The broader lesson extends beyond this specific case. Leverage doesn't exist in isolation. It depends on the target's alternatives, internal cohesion, time horizon, and willingness to absorb costs. When those factors align in ways that reduce vulnerability, even significant economic or political pressure can fail to produce the expected response. The party applying pressure may mistake silence for submission, only to discover later that silence reflected indifference or preparation rather than fear. Understanding when conventional tactics will fail requires accurately assessing not just your own capacity to impose costs, but the other side's capacity and willingness to absorb them without changing course. If you've seen other moments where expected leverage failed to produce movement, drop a comment. The comparison matters. Tap like. This is exactly why. 10:30 p.m. What broke here was not a treaty or a rule. It was a norm. For decades, Washington treated leverage as structural. Canada's reliance on access to the American market was assumed to create urgency. Exposure was equated with fragility. That logic only works if alternatives are unavailable or too slow to matter. Legal analysts and trade experts interviewed by Politico and the Financial Times have repeatedly pointed out that once volatility becomes predictable, institutions adapt. Exposure stops functioning as a pressure point. This moment crossed a line because leverage was tested publicly and failed to compel behavior. Once that happens, leverage stops being persuasive. The collapse of a norm is distinct from the violation of a rule precisely because norms operate through expectation rather than enforcement. Rules have mechanisms: courts, penalties, arbitration procedures. Norms have precedent and practice. When a rule breaks, there's a clear violation and a defined remedy. When a norm breaks, the system continues operating, but the underlying assumptions about how power works and how parties will behave no longer hold. The international trading system didn't malfunction when Canada declined to react as expected. It functioned exactly as designed. What failed was the informal understanding that economic exposure would reliably translate into political compliance. The shift from exposure as vulnerability to exposure as manageable risk represents a fundamental recalibration in how middle powers approach their relationships with larger economies. For generations, the standard playbook for countries like Canada involved careful diplomatic choreography designed to avoid antagonizing their primary trading partner. Economic integration was treated as both opportunity and constraint. Access to American markets enabled prosperity, but that same access created potential points of coercion. The assumption was that any serious threat to market access would trigger immediate policy adjustments, because the costs of disruption would be politically unacceptable. This assumption embedded itself so deeply in strategic thinking that it became invisible, an unstated premise rather than a testable hypothesis. What changed wasn't Canada's actual exposure to the American market, which remained substantial. What changed was the infrastructure surrounding that exposure. Diversification efforts that had once been aspirational became operational. Alternative trade relationships that had once been secondary became viable substitutes, at least for enough sectors to matter. Financial reserves that had once been general precautions became specific buffers for tariff-related disruptions. Domestic political consensus that had once been fragile became durable, as repeated pressure cycles created public support for steady, non-reactive leadership. The technical capacity to manage supply chain disruptions, coordinate provincial responses, and maintain regulatory stability without American cooperation all improved incrementally over years. By the time pressure arrived, the groundwork for absorption was complete. The public nature of the failed leverage attempt carries consequences that extend far beyond the bilateral relationship. When pressure works, it often works quietly, adjustments happen behind closed doors, faces saved, and the appearance of cooperative negotiation is maintained. When pressure fails publicly, everyone watches. Other countries observe that the expected response didn't materialize. Markets note that threatened disruptions didn't trigger panic. Future negotiations inherit the knowledge that similar tactics produced no movement. The bargaining dynamic shifts because the credibility of the threat erodes. This doesn't mean the threatening party loses all influence, but it does mean that influence can no longer be assumed, it must be demonstrated through different mechanisms. The institutional adaptation that legal analysts and trade experts have documented isn't merely defensive, it's transformative. When volatility becomes predictable, institutions don't just build buffers, they redesign processes to function in high-uncertainty environments. Procurement systems build in flexibility rather than efficiency. Trade agreements incorporate safeguards and exit provisions. Regulatory frameworks allow for rapid adjustment without legislative intervention. Diplomatic networks expand beyond traditional partners. Crisis management protocols become routine rather than exceptional. These adaptations don't eliminate the impact of pressure, but they fundamentally alter its character. What once might have constituted an emergency becomes a foreseeable contingency with established response procedures. The distinction between structural and performative leverage matters enormously for understanding contemporary trade relations. Structural leverage exists when one party genuinely lacks alternatives and must adjust to avoid catastrophic costs. Performative leverage exists when the appearance of power is maintained through ritual behaviors, threats issued, concerns expressed, adjustments nominally made, but the underlying compulsion has weakened. The transition from one to the other isn't always visible in real time. Trade volumes might remain similar. Official rhetoric might sound unchanged. But the actual capacity to compel specific behavioral changes through economic pressure diminishes as the target develops both material alternatives and institutional resilience. The erosion of this particular norm has implications for how power operates in multilateral systems generally. If economic exposure no longer reliably produces political compliance among integrated trading partners, then the architecture of economic statecraft requires rethinking. Threats must be more carefully calibrated to address genuine vulnerabilities rather than assumed ones. Negotiations must account for the possibility that the other party has viable outside options. Institutional relationships must be maintained through positive engagement rather than implicit coercion. The shift isn't from American influence to Canadian independence. It's from a system where influence operated automatically through structural position to one where influence requires active maintenance through demonstrated value and reliable partnership. What makes this moment significant isn't that Canada defied the United States. Smaller countries have done that before, often at considerable cost. What makes it significant is that Canada absorbed pressure without visible damage and without changing course. That combination, resilience plus continuity, is what breaks the norm. It demonstrates to other countries that the expected sequence of threat-reaction adjustment isn't inevitable. It shows that institutional preparation can substitute for market size. It proves that patient, procedural responses can outlast aggressive, declaratory pressure. And it establishes precedent that will shape expectations in future disputes, not just between these two countries, but across the broader network of trading relationships where similar assumptions about leverage have gone unexamined. If you believe rules and institutional standards matter regardless of politics, tap like. This is exactly why. This was not an isolated misread. During earlier tariff disputes and renegotiations, Canada absorbed uncertainty, negotiated within formal frameworks and avoided public escalation. Each episode reinforced the same internal lesson: assume volatility, plan accordingly. Reuters and the Washington Post have documented Canada's long-term efforts to diversify trade relationships and harden legal mechanisms over the past decade. One pattern stands out across these cases. Washington treated leverage as an event. Ottawa treated leverage as a condition. That difference matters. The distinction between treating leverage as an event versus a condition reveals fundamentally different strategic orientations toward power and time. When leverage is understood as an event, it becomes a tactical instrument, something deployed at specific moments to achieve discrete outcomes. The logic is transactional. Pressure is applied, a response is expected, and once the desired adjustment occurs, the episode concludes. This approach assumes that leverage exists in reserve, can be activated when needed, and will produce relatively immediate behavioral changes. It privileges short-term maneuvering over long-term positioning and treats each negotiation as a separable encounter rather than as part of a continuous relationship. When leverage is understood as a condition, the entire strategic framework shifts. It becomes environmental rather than tactical, a persistent feature of the relationship that requires permanent adaptation rather than episodic response. Planning doesn't center on how to respond when pressure arrives. It centers on building systems that function effectively under sustained pressure. The goal isn't to resolve each crisis as it emerges but to reduce vulnerability to crisis itself. Investments are made in redundancy, diversification, institutional capacity, and legal frameworks not because a specific threat looms, but because operating in proximity to a much larger economy means threat is always latent. This orientation produces very different policy choices over time. The Canadian learning curve across multiple trade disputes demonstrates how institutional memory compounds into strategic doctrine. The softwood lumber disputes, NAFTA renegotiations, steel and aluminum tariffs, dairy access controversies, each left residue in the form of refined procedures, expanded expertise, strengthened legal positions, and diversified partnerships. Canadian trade officials didn't treat these as isolated problems to be solved and forgotten. They treated them as data points revealing the character of the relationship and the nature of future interactions. Each episode became a stress test for existing systems and a prompt for incremental improvements. The accumulation of these adjustments, largely invisible from outside, created resilience that wasn't apparent until it was tested under sustained pressure. The long-term diversification efforts documented by Reuters and the Washington Post weren't primarily motivated by hostility or strategic rivalry. They emerged from pragmatic risk management. Canadian policymakers recognized that concentration creates fragility regardless of the current state of bilateral relations. Even with a cooperative American administration, over-reliance on a single market exposes an economy to shocks beyond anyone's control. Recessions, regulatory changes, shifts in consumer preferences, supply chain disruptions. Diversification makes sense as insurance even in the absence of deliberate pressure. But it also happens to reduce the effectiveness of coercive tactics when they're deployed. The motivation may be defensive and technocratic, but the effect is strategic. It converts potential leverage into manageable risk. The hardening of legal mechanisms deserves particular attention because it represents a specific choice about how to structure the relationship. Rather than relying on diplomatic flexibility and personal relationships between leaders, Canada invested heavily in formalized dispute resolution processes, trade law expertise, and institutional frameworks that constrain arbitrary action. This approach trades some short-term adaptability for long-term predictability. It makes quick deals harder but also makes sudden reversals more difficult. It shifts power from individuals to procedures, from political will to legal interpretation. For a smaller country dealing with a larger, more powerful neighbor, this trade-off often makes sense. Formalization reduces the advantage that raw power would otherwise provide in purely political negotiations. The event versus condition framework explains why the same tactics that might work in other contexts failed here. If you believe leverage is an event, you calibrate pressure based on the immediate circumstances, current trade flows, political alignment, pending negotiations. You assume that sufficient pressure at the right moment will produce the desired outcome, after which normal relations resume. But if your counterpart treats leverage as a permanent condition, they've already built systems designed to function under exactly the pressure you're applying. Your event is their normal operating environment. The tactics you're deploying aren't shocking or destabilizing, they're expected scenarios that were gamed out and prepared for years earlier. This pattern extends beyond the Canada-US relationship and appears in various forms across the international system. Smaller states dealing with larger neighbors, whether in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere, face similar dynamics. Those that survive and maintain autonomy often do so by treating their vulnerability as a permanent condition requiring continuous management rather than as a series of discrete crises requiring reactive solutions. They build institutional buffers, diversify dependencies, invest in specialized expertise, cultivate alternative partnerships, and develop domestic political consensus around steady, non-reactive leadership. They don't try to match their larger neighbor's power. They structure their systems to function effectively despite the power differential. The American tendency to treat leverage as an event likely stems from a different set of historical experiences. As the dominant economic and military power for decades, the United States has generally operated in environments where its preferences carried weight and where pressure, when applied, often produced results. This created feedback loops that reinforced event-based thinking. Pressure works, therefore apply pressure when you need something. The experience of dealing with multiple smaller countries across different contexts, many of which did adjust their behavior in response to American pressure, created generalizable expectations about how leverage functions. These expectations became assumptions, and assumptions became blind spots. What makes this a pattern rather than an isolated failure is its reproducibility across different issues and timeframes. It's not that one particular negotiating team made a tactical error in one specific instance. It's that the underlying strategic orientation, treating leverage as deployable rather than as environmental, repeatedly encounters the same problem when facing counterparts who've structured themselves to operate under continuous pressure. The tariff threats didn't work not because they were poorly executed but because they targeted a system designed to absorb exactly that kind of pressure. The renegotiation tactics didn't compel urgency not because Canadian negotiators were particularly clever in that moment but because the institutional infrastructure for managing such situations was already operational. The broader implications concern how power is understood and exercised in contemporary international relations. Material capabilities still matter. Economic size, military strength, technological advantage all create genuine forms of power. But the translation of capabilities into actual influence over other actors' behavior is mediated by institutions, alternatives, time horizons, and strategic preparation. A country can possess enormous latent power yet find that power doesn't function as expected in specific contexts because the target has restructured its vulnerabilities. This doesn't eliminate power differentials, but it does complicate their expression and effectiveness. The question of whether this represents a broader pattern or a one-off failure has significant implications for future strategy. If it's a one-off, then the solution is tactical adjustment. Recalibrate pressure, find different leverage points, improve execution. If it's a pattern, then the solution requires strategic reorientation. Rethink how leverage works between integrated economies with divergent strategic orientations, recognize when structural assumptions no longer hold, and develop new approaches that account for institutional resilience rather than assuming automatic compliance. The evidence suggests pattern rather than exception, which means the implications are more profound and the required adjustments more substantial than simple tactical refinement. Share in the comments whether you see this as a broader pattern or a one-off failure. The immediate consequence was not retaliation. It was irrelevance. Pressure that does not change behavior loses credibility. Threats that must be repeated become background noise. Over time, this dynamic produces real cost. Trade experts cited by Reuters have noted that partners begin to hedge by default when U.S. policy appears unpredictable. Hedging does not require hostility. It only requires uncertainty. Canada did not announce independence. It normalized autonomy. Washington, facing limited returns on escalation, narrowed demands and allowed the issue to drift rather than intensify. That is how systems conserve resources when leverage no longer promises results. Stay with me because the deeper implication goes beyond Canada. This episode is not about winners and losers. It is about how modern power works when institutions stop believing in permanence. Leverage is not something you own. It is something you maintain. Once it is priced in rather than feared, it stops compelling action. Canada did not challenge American power directly. It stopped organizing itself around it. That is the quiet lesson here. Power does not need to be overthrown to be neutralized. It only needs to become non-decisive. If you want calm, fact-driven breakdowns that explain what headlines leave out, subscribe. This channel focuses on how institutions actually behave when pressure meets reality,